Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most Mandarin learners put all their faith in comprehensible input, a so-called magic bullet that can solve all your language learning problems that's been around for years. But if this really was the magic bullet, then why do the majority of Mandarin learners still not have the ability to hold a simple conversation? And so I've been through this struggle myself. After researching and experimenting over the last few years with my Mandarin learning, in this video, I want to show you how to use comprehensible input the right way, so that you don't waste years and years stuck at a beginner level not having conversations. No expensive classes, no endless grammar drills, just a simple proven method that works. You don't need to live in China, and you almost certainly don't need to be gifted or talented, as a lot of people like to say. In this video, I'll break down what works and what doesn't so that you can finally start speaking Mandarin with confidence. First of all, we've got to look into the problems with comprehensible input and just using pure input to learn Mandarin. Now, first of all, when you're listening and reading, you overestimate your ability to understand. When you listen and read, there's no pressure to understand every single word in a sentence. However, when you're having a conversation, you very much have this pressure because someone's looking at you eagerly for a reply. So if you haven't understood what's actually been said, there's no way you're going to be able to reply. As a Mandarin teacher, I frequently ask some of my students, how much of this story do you understand? And they'll tell me quite confidently 80 to 90%. And then when we start having a discussion around the topics that are discussed in the story and go into it in a bit more detail and really dig into it, I find that's really not the case. Why? Because they've overestimated how much they can listen, they can understand when we're just listening and reading to it, because there's not this pressure there to really understand. The second problem I see with comprehensible input, it probably works, but it's incredibly slow. So there's been a few people that have been documenting their progress with comprehensible input and comparing it to, using a combination of input and traditional methods. And what they find, what kind of some of these people have been saying is that comprehensible input is just so slow because you're listening for thousands and thousands of hours before you can start, reaching a level where you can have conversations. The third problem I see with the whole input-only crowd is it kind of goes against what we know about learning in terms of other things. No one will recommend that as a medical student you just sit there with a text with as many different textbooks as you possibly can and read as much as you can all day. That is not an effective way that's going to help you pass your exams. As well as this, if you're learning to ride a bike, no one would tell you watch tons and tons of videos of people riding a bike and then you'll be able to just suddenly one day be able to do this. That's not how these things work. What we know from research is that effective learning almost always requires an active component. So a component where you're actually engaging, you're trying to recall what you've learned. That's the active component. And number 4, comprehensible input makes a really good product. If you're a language learning business, going down the comprehensible input route is a really attractive way to get lots and lots of customers and to kind of do some expectation reversal, as it's called in marketing, where you tell them, you don't need to do grammar, you don't need to do flashcards, you don't need to do all this boring stuff, you just sit and watch TV all day and you'll get fluent. That sells as a product. And I'm not saying that selling a product is a bad thing. I think if you do a really good, well-designed language course and you try and help people and you make sure that you're not ripping people off, etc. I don't see any problem at all with trying to sell a course. That's not what I'm trying to say here. But what I do see is that if you use too much comprehensible input in your marketing, you're effectively, telling people you can sit around and watch TV all day or listen all day and you'll naturally pick up the language and get really fluent. And that's exactly what people want to hear. They don't want to hear, as well as doing input, you should do some flashcards, you should do some shadowing to practice your pronunciation, you should try and get conversation practice regularly, because these things are hard. Active study is hard. It's much harder than passive. So and as a result of that, a lot of the time, so for example, in medical school, active study is really draining, but it gets results. And I did find the same in my Mandarin learning journey. Having loads and loads of conversations in Mandarin was draining. Doing loads and loads of flashcards in Mandarin was draining, but it really got me some results fast. So anyway, with all of that in mind, with the idea that it can be used kind of as a marketing tactic, you kind of have to take that with a pinch of salt. But I do have to say, it does work for some people. You know, I have seen videos of people on YouTube. I remember there's this German guy on YouTube that, you know, he had learned a little bit of English in school, probably done some grammar, etc., you know, the traditional methods. And then he started immersing like 24 hours a day in English, just switched everything that he possibly could into English. I mean, he probably, I don't know, for some reason he had an awful lot of time, so he just used all day, every day, to just listen to English. And he did that for like 6 years, and then spoke English for the first time on YouTube. And provided he's, you know, he's telling the truth here, which I think he is, you know, pretty fluent, like almost native like. So I think there are some examples of, you know, where comprehensible input and pure input has worked well, but again, it is slow. You know, 6 years of doing almost 24 hours a day of immersion is an awful lot, and it's kind of a luxury that most of us can't afford. And also bear in mind, a lot of these immersion learners probably have some kind of background in that they've done some amount of traditional study before they go and do a load of immersion and input. I'm yet to see someone that's kind of learned Mandarin to a really high level just from pure input. Some of the best Mandarin speakers out there, a lot of the best Mandarin speakers out there probably aren't even, you know, they're not famous. They don't have a YouTube channel. They don't promote themselves. They just live in China and speak excellent Mandarin. But the ones that do promote themselves, that speak absolutely amazing Mandarin, they almost, like all of them, have some element of active study in there. All of them have done some grinding. Finally, you have to remember, a lot of the people kind of recommending comprehensive input and doing an input-based approach in general, a lot of them actually recommend doing some active study alongside this. So for example, some flashcards and shadowing, etc., and eventually speaking practice. So what should you do? Well, here's the thing, you've got to make that decision for yourself, but what I would suggest is, whilst listening and reading is definitely important, please keep this up. Like, doing lots and lots of different listening and reading is a great way to expose yourself to the language and, you know, improve your language skills. Input is important, but remember to add in some dedicated study time as well, doing some flashcards, doing a little bit of grammar study, and then also doing some output practice. So actually practicing speaking. You know, this will really, the combination of, you know, input, little bit of studying every day, probably like 20-30 minutes a day, plus output practice will really speed things up, and make sure you are actively using the language as much as you can and challenging yourself. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Guys, if you're enjoying my Mandarin tips, I'd actually recommend going and subscribing to my 7-day email course, where I talk about more in-depth Mandarin learning methods. I'll also help you learn 80 key chunks, so 50 sentence starters and 30 sentence patterns that I think are really important for conversational Mandarin, with the help of 2 PDFs that I built and flashcards too. So if you're interested, go and check that out in the link in the description below, or scan the QR codes to go and sign up for that. I look forward to seeing you inside.